So you probably already know this, but I'm currently rewatching Arrow after I finished rewatching The Flash, and every time I finish a season of both those shows, I rank all the episodes of that season in a video. Now I finished Season 1, I finished Season 2, and now I finished Season 3. I'm actually currently rewatching Season 4, so that's great and all, but I finished Season 3, so obviously I'm going to rank all the episodes of this season from worst to best. I'll give very short reviews, and you'll see my score for each episode. So with that in mind, let's get into the ranking for every episode of Arrow Season 3.
No. Because I wrote it 5 years ago.
It's like fighting a fire with gasoline.
Who are you?
Season 4 is really bad, and this episode feels like it's from Season 4. It kind of feels like they took this episode and made an entire season out of it, but nevertheless, I think this episode has got to be the worst episode of the season, as it focuses more on Felicity Smoak, shows her backstory, and features Donna Smoak as well. I think it introduces her too, and has Brother Eyes, the main villain. All of that is really bad, and this is really the beginning of Felicity becoming kind of an unbearable character, and I think it all kind of started around here, and this episode overall I think is by far the worst of the season.
No. You were delivered by the prophecy. Your name is Al-Sahim.
My name is Oliver Queen.
The season finale of Season 3 was not a good one, especially compared to the first two, but this one is not very good. The final fight between Oliver and Raish, it's really bad because you can't really tell who is who, and the fact that Oliver manages to kill Ra's al Ghul, even if Raish did let him, that's just not something that should ever happen. Ra's al Ghul shouldn't really ever die, unless in like a crazy alternate reality, but also Batman should do it if it ever does happen, not the Green Arrow or something like that, so that's a bummer. But also the ending with Oliver and Felicity riding off into the sunset, it's all not very good, making this the first bad finale in Arrow.
Never gonna happen.
One night with me, that'll all change.
This episode is kind of similar to episode 5. It does feel very Season 4-esque, as the whole storyline with Oliver being jealous of Ray with Felicity, it's terrible. It makes Oliver a very unlikable character. That's not the only reason Oliver is kind of unlikable in this season, but it is a big part of why he is. But also Cupid, terrible villain. She's just so over the top, and she does not fit the tone of Arrow at all, especially in the season. She does fit the tone of Arrow Season 4, which is not a compliment for the season, but in this season the tone is still consistent with the rest of the show, and she just feels so out of place. So overall, another not very good episode at all.
You don't have to come back if you don't want to.
This episode I thought mostly was, just okay, definitely not good, just okay, as the season is in general, as I really don't like the season-long storyline. It makes Oliver so unlikable, him trusting Malcolm, but also shielding him because he wants to protect Thea's soul. It makes no sense. It's so stupid, and it makes Oliver very unlikable. Overall, I think Laurel is probably the most likable character in the season. Either way, that does affect episodes like this one, not to mention that Felicity happens in this episode, which does not help it at all, making it, worse than most of the episodes of this season.
To a sword fight.
Like I said, I really don't like the season-long storyline, and this one in particular. In this episode, I mentioned this in the Fallen review, or the short review, but in this episode, Oliver goes out of his way to wage war with the League. When the season basically ended, there's no more conflict. He goes to save Malcolm Merlyn just so he can save Thea's soul, because down the line, she'll realize that she killed her father, even though her father is a terrorist and a murderer, or a mass murderer. It's a stupid season-long storyline. It makes Oliver so unlikable, and it's most prevalent in this episode. The only reason it's higher than the rest of the episodes so far is the lack of Felicity and things like that, but it's still really bad and really infuriating, and I genuinely dislike Oliver in episodes like this one.
You have failed this city.
The first episode of the season definitely has its ups and downs. Like, Sarah's death, I think is pretty emotional. I think it should have stuck. Going based off Season 4, I'll obviously talk about this more in the Season 4 video, but I do not think she should have been brought back. I think it was sufficient motivation for making Laurel the Black Canary. Either way, that part of it I actually didn't mind very much, but the fact that Count Vertigo was a very disappointing and generally bad villain, and all the Felicity stuff, that definitely brings this episode down quite a lot.
Everyone is looking to me to lead. If I grieve, nobody else gets to. Whoever did this, I'm gonna find them.
Following up from the first episode of the season where Sarah died and now they're dealing with that, specifically Laurel, I do not like that they didn't tell Quentin. I think it makes no sense and it's really, really stupid and it just creates conflict that just didn't need to be there. But I do think that Laurel dealing with Sarah's death and the rest of Team Arrow doing that as well, and the fight against Komodo, while Komodo was a very, very disappointing and very wasted villain, his storyline here, how he was used in the episode, was not bad at all. Not to mention that the flashbacks in this episode are definitely some of the more memorable of the season, including Tommy Merlin, and having him kind of interconnected into the flashback storyline. That was not bad at all, but overall, you know, just an okay episode.
I'm never coming back to Starling City.
The truth is the only thing that's gonna bring her back.
You will lose her, Oliver, forever.
You've come along.
I do realize that I just had episode 1, 2, and 3 in a row, and I don't know, just the beginning of the season was not very good, but each episode was a tiny bit better than the episode before it for at least episodes 1, 2, and 3. In this one, the storyline with Thea, the changes they made to Thea, I did like that quite a lot, not to mention that the Argus part of the episode, not bad at all, and I do also like the fact that Laurel began her training, and overall, an okay episode, a little better than episodes 1 or 2, but also definitely has the problems that Season 3 has, just, you know, not the exact same ones.
We are gonna take over the blades.
I don't know what happens next.
This episode came right after Oliver was killed by Ra's al Ghul, and this episode explained how he didn't die, which I thought was such a flimsy excuse or a flimsy way to make him not dead. He was just given some sort of herb or something like that. I really don't like that. I mean, they had the Lazarus Pit right there that could have made for a much more interesting storyline where Oliver actually went into the Lazarus Pit, healed his wounds, and then because of that, the whole storyline with him becoming the next Ra's al Ghul, it becomes a thing or something like that. I think that would have been a lot better. So that was annoying, not to mention that the focus on Felicity and her whole storyline in this episode was pretty bad, but other than that, I do like the whole concept of Oliver being gone and the rest of Team Arrow having to continue his crusade on their own. I think that part of it did work.
It's Sarah.
Suppressed memories often resurface in dreams.
Whoever did this was trying to send the message.
This episode was mostly self-contained, except for the Roy storyline. Roy thinking that he killed Sarah, that definitely made for a pretty good storyline. That would have made for a much better conclusion and answer for who killed Sarah, instead of Merlin setting Thea up to kill her, which is kind of nonsensical. It makes no sense whatsoever in terms of his plan, but I think this would have been just a lot better. Anyway, that storyline was good, Wildcat's storyline was fine, and the connection to the flashbacks were fine as well. Overall, except for Roy getting his Arsenal name, I think that it's mostly just okay, and him getting his Arsenal name, that was definitely pretty awesome.
There's only one thing left of him now. Us. You must eliminate this threat.
In this episode, Oliver finally became El Sahim, and he became the heir to the demon, and he served as the antagonist of this episode, which honestly was not that bad. It honestly made for a pretty interesting and unique episode. Still, it isn't great. I wouldn't say it's great at all, and I would even say it's good, just like the rest or most of the season, but this episode, I think, is at least better than the episodes we've gone over so far.
Now.
I know where to find the canary. It is our home that is under attack.
I guess we're even now.
This is the second part of the Oliver is not around storyline, where he is hanging out with Tatsu, which that part of it wasn't bad. I didn't like how they brought him back, but him actually hanging out with Tatsu and Maseo, that definitely was not as bad. And I did like the storyline here with Brick as the villain, Laurel becoming the Black Canary, and Brick kidnapping these aldermen. That was all not bad at all. And while the storyline with Felicity and Ray was pretty garbage, this episode overall, I think, is an average episode for this season, and relatively okay.
And then kill him. I can give you a whole world to save.
There is more than one path to justice. Maybe I should be Ra's al Ghul.
Now, the Ra's al Ghul offering the main hero to be the next Ra's al Ghul is very much copying a Batman storyline, and they never should have done that, nor should they ever had Ra's al Ghul as the main villain of a season of Arrow. But either way, this storyline was, in terms of the fact that it should not have been done, it was handled, I guess, as well as it could have been, and that was fine, at least in this episode. I do not like the flashbacks in this episode, like, even more than usual. This season's flashbacks are not great. They're not terrible necessarily. I think that they're just okay, but I do think that this episode's flashbacks were terrible, as Akio had a very big role, and even though he is a kid, he, even for a kid actor, is not good. I mean, that's even for a kid actor, so that does not help this episode at all, but this episode, I think, is at least, it's fine, whatever.
My father may be the demon, but yours is the devil.
Father of the year.
Break your vows. Kill your sister's father.
Kill him!
Oliver, Nyssa, and the rest of Team Arrow going after Merlin, and Oliver learning that Merlin is alive, and the confrontations between those two, that was not bad at all. Not to mention that Ra's al Ghul's debut, him saying that Oliver Queen courts war with us, even though I really don't like this storyline, like I said, of Oliver protecting Merlin, it just makes no sense, especially later in the season, but also here. But I do like this debut. I think it's a really cool moment for Ra's al Ghul. So overall, in the top 10 of the season, one of the better of the season, but considering this is just an okay episode, and it's in the top 10, really shows how mediocre this season is.
To defeat this man, you must think like him. Be like him.
This is the big finale to the Brick storyline, and it's fine. Again, it's an okay episode, as I think that Oliver's return and them actually defeating Brick, that's all very satisfying. Like, those are some awesome moments, and I do think that this episode has its moments, but it does have its problems as well. Like Oliver going to Merlin to help for training instead of just serving him up to Ra's al Ghul, or how Felicity reacts to Oliver's return. It's just so stupid. Even though I do agree with her that Oliver should not be working with Merlin, she's so annoying about how she goes about it that I just end up finding myself agreeing with her, but also wanting to not agree with her because she's so annoying in these moments. So overall, an okay episode, but still one of the best of the season.
This ends now. Oliver, the whole place is gonna blow.
Hi, sis.
You're not real.
In this episode, Oliver finally returned to Team Arrow, and like I said, he was fairly unlikable in this season, and not only because of how he was protecting Merlin, but also in like this episode where he's totally against Laurel. Now, I do think that it doesn't really make much sense for Laurel to be a superhero at this point, but again, the way Oliver goes about it in this moment, in this episode, it's kind of aggravating, not to mention that the flashbacks, like the rest of the season, are not very good, and the storyline with Thea and this Chase guy, it's fine, not great, but I actually do like Laurel's storyline in this episode. I think Laurel, like I said earlier, is the most likable character in this season, so an episode focusing around mostly her, I think is going to be one of the best of the season.
There's only death or survival. What kind of psycho will put that thing there?
Me?
Now, yes, this is a very disappointing return of Slade Wilson, as an episode featuring Slade should have been way better, not to mention that Thea was able to defeat him by herself, which shouldn't happen. The way I can explain this is either he's out of practice, or the Mirror Crew is affecting him mentally but not affecting him physically, so he's not really used to this, or he's not really all there still. So I think that it kind of explains why Thea defeated him. Still, that should not really happen, as Slade is still incredibly badass, way more than Thea, even without the Mirror Crew, so that shouldn't have happened. But still, Slade is still pretty enjoyable in this episode, in spite of the fact that it should have been better. And the reason I like this episode even more so than that is because of the flashbacks. Probably the best episode of flashbacks in this season, as we see the different perspective on Oliver not being around in the present day a couple years ago, or in the flashbacks, I mean, during that year, as we see Laurel, we see Thea, we see Tommy, and we see Quentin, and even Diggle and Felicity. I think all of that was really, really cool. Oliver Return to Star City made for the best flashbacks of the season. Still not amazing flashbacks, but the best of the season. So this episode overall was again one of the better ones of the season.
Or die.
You asked us to trust you, and we trusted you!
Oliver Queen is dead.
The penultimate episode of the season was certainly better than the finale, but still not exactly a good episode, as there were a lot of stupid moments. The season-long storyline unfolding, I didn't like it very much. It didn't make very much sense, and even Oliver's plan to infiltrate the League of Assassins, in the end, it didn't even work, and it wasn't very good at all. So overall, definitely not my favorite episode, but still one of the best of the season, and it does have some good fight scenes, and it has kind of an epic feel to it as the League of Assassins go up against Team Arrow. And although Laurel should not be able to go up against or defeat one member of the League of Assassins, let alone plenty, I think that it's excusable, as this fight is definitely not bad, making this one of the better episodes of the season, in spite of the fact that it's just okay.
Your rightful place is heir to the demon.
My brother's gonna kill you.
He's going to beg me. Birth and rebirth are violent acts.
I think overall, the best storyline in the season had to do with Quentin Lance being completely distraught at Laurel and at Team Arrow, and then he goes after them, so the police go after them. I think that was actually pretty awesome. That was pretty epic. And while this episode is not as good as the other episode, Public Enemy, which I'll get to in a minute, it still has its moments. As we see Roy go to prison, that whole thing was pretty crazy, and that, although him leaving, I'm not a fan of. He literally should have stuck around in the show for the entirety of the time, unless he goes to join the Teen Titans or the Titans or something like that. So I'm not a fan of him leaving, but the fact that it wasn't really up to the writers or the showrunners, it was up to the actor, I can't really fault the show for that. So I still do like this episode quite a lot, making this in the top 5 of the season.
Be prisoner.
It's like the whole city has lost their minds.
It's just one man. Shoot to kill him.
So like I said, the cop storyline, the cops chasing Team Arrow, that was pretty awesome. And in this episode, the cops chasing them down was especially cool. Like, it had a very epic feel to it. This episode could have been a very good episode. However, the storyline with Ray and, Felicity and Donna, not exactly a storyline that I would consider good. In fact, it's a storyline that I would consider really, really bad. Really, any scene that contains Donna Smoke is a bad scene and a bad storyline. So that definitely brings this episode down quite a bit. I didn't even mention the whole thing with Ray and Oliver in the last episode, which was fine, didn't love it, but in this episode I thought the cop storyline, them chasing Team Arrow, that was good enough to make this one of the best episodes of the season, and actually a pretty good episode.
You have no idea what this city is up against.
Oliver Queen is the Arrow.
What are you going?
Now again, I did not like the fact that Deadshot was killed off, very similar to Roy. It wasn't really the showrunner's fault or the writer's fault, because for Roy, the actor wanted to leave the show, but for Deadshot, it was even less responsible for the people behind Arrow, as it was Warner Brothers who mandated them leave Deadshot or kill him off, as they wanted to use him in the DCEU, which was such a waste of a character. He should not have been killed off this early, but again, I can't really blame the show for that, because the storyline with the Suicide Squad was pretty awesome. Also, Deadshot's death was actually a pretty cool death, even though it shouldn't have happened, but also I actually really liked the storyline with Oliver and Ray, as the fight scene between the two, it felt very similar to Flash vs. Arrow, like these two superheroes going up against each other. It kind of felt like a crossover in that regard, so because of that, I do think this is one of the best episodes of the season.
We do this my way.
Yes, this is gonna be awesome.
Who would win, me or you? When I'm fighting you, it's literally like you're standing still.
Ironically, unlike Suicidal Tendencies, and very much unlike Flash vs. Arrow, this episode doesn't really feel like much of a crossover. It feels more like an episode of Arrow with Arrow storylines, our Arrow characters, and the Arrow flashbacks that just so happen to also have Barry, Cisco, and Caitlin from The Flash. It feels like less like a crossover, just like an episode of Arrow featuring some guest stars, and because of that, I think it's one of the worst crossover episodes we've gotten so far. However, it's definitely not bad. It's a lot of fun. The villain, Captain Boomerang, is a pretty good villain, and overall, it's definitely one of the best episodes of the season, but it's not even a 9 out of 10. I think it could have been a lot better had it felt like an actual crossover.
Most dangerous man that has ever walked the earth.
You've taken your last life.
You've lived your last day.
This episode is currently, meaning before Season 8, the highest rated episode of Arrow ever, second only to Lian Yu, and while I think Lian Yu deserves to be the highest rated episode of Arrow ever, I do not think The Climb deserves to be anywhere near, as while it is certainly good, I don't think it's great, let alone amazing or even perfect, as the fight scene between Rach and Oliver, certainly pretty great, and the moment where Oliver dives, it's definitely got a lot of shock value. I remember when it happened, it definitely got a lot of people talking, and it was a pretty crazy moment, but it also was a moment that it really couldn't have gone anywhere. I mean, they weren't going to kill off the main character, not in Season 3 when there are 5 seasons left. I mean, we didn't know that at that point, but it was a pretty popular show, a lot more than it is now, so it was likely that it was going to get a lot more seasons, so I think the shock value there didn't really work as well, not to mention that there are a lot of cheesy moments, the season-long storyline doesn't really work, and the reveal that Thea was behind the killing of Sarah, or she was set up by Merlin, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever, and I do not like it. So while this episode does have a lot of great things about it, and it certainly is the best episode of the season, I don't think it deserves to be as high rated as it is on IMDb, or to be considered one of the best episodes of Arrow, as it's just pretty good and not amazing. So anyway, that is my ranking for every episode of Arrow Season 3. Certainly not the best season of Arrow, certainly one of the worst seasons of Arrow actually, and definitely is the beginning of the downfall of the show, but I don't think it's anywhere near the worst season of Arrow, as there is another season that is miles worse and is infinitely worse than anything Arrow's ever done, or anything that the Arrowverse as a whole has ever done, and that includes things like Supergirl Season 1, and that's obviously the upcoming season, Arrow Season 4, which I already have watched a lot of, and I could say it's so bad, and I am both not looking forward to ranking all the episodes, and at the same time am looking forward to just ripping into the season yet again, and this time in every single episode. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.